Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Noura Rebai, and I have the pleasure to welcome all of you joining us for the first webinar in a new OECD seminar series called Better Evidence Use for Better Policies. You may recognize this as a twist on the OECD's own motto, Better Policies for Better Lives. And we made a deliberate change because we believe that the thoughtful and systematic use of research evidence is a cornerstone of better policies. So efforts to strengthen the use of evidence in education are not new. Many countries have invested heavily in making education more evidence-informed in the past decades. But some challenges seem to persist. Education research itself is not always conclusive, sometimes even contradictory. It is not always synthesized or communicated in ways that are accessible to those who need it. And in addition, decisions are shaped not just by evidence, but also stakeholders' demands, their professional experience, and political agendas. And let's be honest, in today's world, science itself is not always safe from political pressures. So over the past 4 years, the OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation has been working to explore recent developments and good practices. And we mapped what countries and organizations do to support practitioners and policymakers' engagement with research. We also mapped the persistent barriers and some new challenges. And this has led us to launch a new program called Evidence Web in Education. And this seminar series is part of this new work. So this initiative supports evidence intermediaries, also known as knowledge brokers. And these are all the people and organizations who make intentional efforts to support the use of evidence in policy and practice. So before we start, let me just share one personal reflection. When we first invited countries to host peer learning seminars to improve the use of evidence in education, I was perhaps naively surprised by the responses. And this is because the countries that volunteered were the ones that I thought were the most advanced in this field. But over time, I came to understand two important things. First, being advanced does not mean that all challenges just go away. Even where strong structures and processes are in place, gaps still remain. For example, the cultures of evidence use may vary across institutions, capacities may be uneven, or efforts might be fragmented. At the same time, some countries are just only starting to set up knowledge and analytical units within ministries, or are still just exploring how to best support the use of evidence in decision making. The second realization was that becoming advanced involves a strong commitment to continuous learning. Celebrate what works, but also ask what could work better. And it's precisely this spirit of curiosity, humility, and collaboration that we hope to foster through our seminar series. We are really thrilled to have so many participants from actually 5 continents, all united by this shared ambition to make evidence use in education more systematic and more thoughtful. And with that, I'm very pleased to hand over to my colleague Tali Malkin, who is leading this series and who will guide us through today's session.
Thanks, Nora. Hi, everyone. I'm very, very happy to see all of you here. I've been in contact with some of you. So I lead our project's peer learning activities, and we aim to build capacity for knowledge intermediaries and foster a peer community. We're launching the series as a forum for sharing experience and insights on how to improve the use of evidence in education policy, as Nora explained. And the plan is together to explore key challenges and solutions to effective knowledge mobilization practices. And we're hoping to do this through open, engaging dialogue with all of you who are working to make policy more evidence-informed. So we'll get back to talking about the whole series in a minute, but first, what are we planning for today? So this is a 1-hour session. We'll have a great keynote speaker. We'll have previews of some of the topics that we plan to address later in the series. And we have an interactive part. And this is particularly important for us because we really want to start a conversation We really need your input so that we can tailor the webinar series as closely as possible to your needs and interests. So just as the series itself is meant to be very interactive and participatory, today we're hoping for your engagement as well. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today Eric Gilliardi. Eric is a prominent climate scientist at L'Océan IPSL in France and professor of climate science at the University of Reading in the UK. He is active on public outreach and is currently president of the Office of Climate Education under UNESCO and a member of the CNRS Ethics Committee and the French National Education Scientific Council. And we've invited Eric to speak to us today because, as many of you know, bringing an evidence-informed approach into policymaking can be particularly challenging today in some settings. Eric has deeply reflected on the role of scientists in society and their relationship with policymakers. So we're confident his insights will offer both inspiration and hopefully some practical directions on how to rebuild trust in science. Please feel free to share your questions on the Zoom chat. We'll try to address some of those later in the session. Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tali, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here. So as a climate scientist and also oceanographer, which you can see from the hopper behind me, which is really a painting I like, I've been involved in a number of relationship with policy making, and first and foremost being an IPCC lead author some years ago. And this led me to, as Tali was saying, to reflect on what is really our role as scientists in the scene. So I've prepared a few slides to share with you. I hope you're seeing them all right. Yes. So here I propose to talk about public advocacy of scientists, which is a topic not exactly the same as policy advice, but on the verge, and you'll see how it relates. And this is really a question we ask ourselves as scientists: how can we engage safely, effectively, and responsibly with a number of the rest of the society? I would say this is not something natural, certainly not for us climate scientists, although we're learning. So first, what are we talking about? So public advocacy is a part of different types of science-society interactions. First, there's one, as scientists we all know well, which is the public engagement, which is the sharing of scientific knowledge, science communication, expertise, policy advice, etc. Another one is citizen science, where we're going to involve the citizen in providing, being part of the scientific endeavor. And the last one, which is the one I want to talk about today, is the public advocacy, which I will define as soon as we speak publicly as scientists, as an academic researcher, and using our authority as our position in the scientific field, and we express ourselves with a normative stance. That means pushing people to act. That means some evaluative or prescriptive stance on moral, political, or social issue. We're doing public advocacy. So of course, there's no watertight definition with the previous ones. You can start, for example, an interview as doing public engagement and finish it as doing public advocacy. But it's important to distinguish those different types of interacting between the science and society. So another perspective is to think about the role of science in society, and here we go from research to decision making. And to me, there are basically three stages we can think of. One is the research, which is creating new knowledge. That's what I do in my lab. That's what scientists do. For example, understanding the role of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Then there's a stage of state of the art. The society is going to ask us, okay, what do we know on a certain topic? For example, doing an IPCC report. And the third one is mobilizing this established knowledge for decision making. For example, what happens during COPs, climate COPs, etc. And of course, these are scientists can play a role in all those three, and the relative balance of values that drive each varies. And for example, in the first one, clearly the values of administrating proof, what we call the scientific endeavor, providing robustness, is essential. But as slowly, when we move to the last one, the personal and social values will come in. And this is where public advocacy starts creeping in. And of course, there's nothing wrong about all this. It's just we have to realize these different entry points of values that drive our action. For example, a good example for me is COVID, which was the same virus. The research was made many places, but creating new knowledge. And of course, if you go to the last one, what was mobilized was a number of social decisions, from lockdown to no lockdown, etc. Because the last part was really depending on the values that drive societies, the level of acceptable risk, etc. So I think it's useful to distinguish those three stages. Right. So public advocacy is a ethical question because there are conflicting values, of course. As I said, it's a new issue for us. Medical research has been faced with this for a long time. And there's a question of positioning. Am I a scientist? Am I an expert, a citizen, an activist? How to deal with this strange notion of neutrality that we hear, the values we just heard about, trust, credibility, legitimacy. Are we being sometimes naive, manipulated, or even worse, irrelevant? How do we balance, or do we want to balance technocracy that a few with the knowledge should tell everybody how they should live versus democracy? Also the public good versus private interests, be the private interest of scientists, of course, but also of the media, of politicians or stakeholders in general, which had to wear what advocacy to do. And beyond COVID, there are numerous historical examples. For example, the Manhattan Project, and you've probably seen that amazing movie a few years ago, Oppenheimer, which really dealt on this issue, the question of bioethics, etc. So this is really the questions we're faced with. Example of ethical questions involving public advocacy. For example, when you sign a position article in a newspaper or editorial in Nature, if you denounce greenwashing, if you contribute to the work of NGOs or think tanks, advocating for climate solutions on social media, leveraging on public or pupils, as we talk about education, emotions. So all the climate emergency narrative, and a related one with potential tipping points, boundaries, what I call deadlinism, that we have that many years left to do something, etc. So then basically the question for us scientists is how to engage in public advocacy. I think it's important that scientists do that, but they do it effectively and safely without risking their reputation. This is really what prevents most scientists of doing public advocacy, because they are risking the values shared by the research community, and they are seen as departing from the neutrality usually expected from researchers. And that could jeopardize impartiality or credibility. So these questions need to be addressed collectively. And there's a strong demand, not only from society, but also from the youth, and especially the young scientists arriving in our field. Right, so in that context, we produced a couple of years ago in the CNRS Ethics Committee an opinion that we call Freedom and Responsibility, Academics, Researchers, Public Advocacy. And the main points, and I'll go in more detail in a minute. First, we believe that there's no incompatibility with the norm attributed to research, doing that public advocacy. It should be understood as a researcher's individual freedom. This is really important. And then also responsible public advocacy involves fulfilling certain duties, namely explaining where you're speaking from, and also being true to the robustness of science and scientific integrity. We'll talk about the Royal Institution in a minute at the end. So on the neutrality question, sometimes we feel, and I was like this presenting IPCC reports, like, oh, I'm sharing with you the IPCC results, so I'm neutral. Well, neutral would mean value-free, and of course, value-free research or advocacy does not exist. And it's nice to think that the researchers can set aside his or her values entirely. So where is this neutrality coming from? Well, it's coming, and this is really when the scientific endeavor was being established mostly in the 19th century, and from, for example, the Claude Bernard medical researcher, that experimental results must be observed with the mind free of assumptions and preconceived ideas. And this was really the ideal of research and that we'll strive for. But of course, this is totally impossible. And this was the ideal at the time. But now we know that science is socially constructed. Early work by Bruno Latour or Hélène Longino have shown that we as scientists are part of a social environment. It's a human endeavor. It's embedded in the social context. So rather than hiding values, identifying them and making them explicit is really important. And that doesn't mean we're not going to respect the integrity and rigor that underpin the scientific process. And so rather than the word neutrality, we propose to use the word reliability, which means it's following the robustness of the scientific endeavor, but also it's important for society. The civil servant neutrality is more a functional neutrality, is not a limitation on the freedom of expression. Right, another thing is that, well, aren't we transgressing the boundary between science and politics? And with this audience, of course, you know, the benefits of separating expertise from the public decision making has its justification and virtues. But in practice, the boundary between science and politics is hardly watertight. Knowledge production is of direct interest to the citizen, and rightly so, it is political. And also when a scientist on the radio or TV or in an op-ed pushes to some action, everybody understands he's not a political personnel, and so the political autonomy is not called in question because he's speaking publicly. The last one, of course, is it a breach of legal or ethical standards applicable to research? Of course, researchers also, like any citizen, bound by the limits of common law of freedom of expression. But that freedom of expression guarantees a high degree of freedom of speech, especially for scientists. And we all know, and we have examples starting in different countries, well, not starting in countries we thought this would never happen, when the freedom of expression of a scientist starts to be restricted, that usually does not finish well in terms of democracy. So in practice, there are little restriction by the legal and ethical rules in force. Now, there's the special case of civil disobedience. I won't go into that. If you have questions, I can answer, but which really requires a case-by-case approach. Right, so now the second point, it should remain a personal choice for researcher, individual freedom. There is, again, no professional obligation to engage in public advocacy. It's something you can do, but you don't have to do it. And the researcher should not be forced to seek support from groups, because it's an individual freedom. As we just saw how important this freedom is. But, and we put a big but here, there are a number of good reasons and advantages in seeking collective platform for advocacy, exchanging ideas with peers, being less exposed to potential damage to your reputation, etc. And here I want to stress out the role of boundary organizations that can be useful relays so that individual scientists are less exposed and they can come together. So a number of existing of those intermediary or boundary organizations that can know how to speak to both sides, the science and the policy making. However, again, the collective should not condition or hinder that individual advocacy, which is really a personal freedom. Finally, a safe and responsible advocacy comes with duties. What we call a situated advocacy with integrity and scientific rigor. First, it requires a bit of prior reflection of the responsibility that advocacy entails. We are put behind a microphone, or we have the potential to reach a lot of people, and that comes with responsibility. Also, being aware of the risks of your academic reputation, the image of institution, of research, or even the quality of the public debate you are trying to contribute to. So complying with those best practices is really an ethical duty. So it's two parts. First, be clear about where you're talking from, your point of view. Consider how to introduce yourself without misleading your audience. Declare any conflicts of interest you may have. And this conflict of interest, it can be a huge diversity of them. Explain the values, because necessary values they are that underpin your commitment. Now, when I go in front of an audience to share the result of my PCC, I explain them why I'm here. I should be in my lab doing research. Why did I decide to come in front of these people to share what we know and discuss with them? Because I think a changing climate can create human suffering. So I'm going out of my lab to come. Okay, then since I'm doing that, the attention I get is completely different. And putting your speech in perspective. Am I sharing the results of a IPCC report with hundreds of scientists that came into together to have something really robust, or is it a paper published last week still subject to confirmation? Second one is the advocacy with integrity and scientific rigor. We have to stay true to our mission to produce or present robust knowledge. And respecting that scientific integrity and scientific approach is essential. For example, in some cases, the journalists or the people interviewing us may want us to make a story a bit more impactful or sexy, if you like, than it really is. And it's hard to resist. So you have to learn to stay true to, okay, this is what we know. And now you may decide, make it clear, change your hat. Okay, now I'm talking as a citizen, but it's really important. So all this is not to not do advocacy, but to do it without being regarded as a militant or an activist, which is always the risk that if you don't follow these, you may have. Right, so of course, all that is nice and theoretical. Now, when you have 30 seconds on the TV, you're not going to explain your values, where you're talking from, etc. So obviously, this should not prevent researchers, these methods, from being strong advocates. And as I say, it's the opposite. It's okay to engage without full scientific evidence, but you have to say so. Speaking outside your expertise, it's okay. You can do your homework, but say so. Really that work of prior work to think, okay, what authority do I have to express myself in public on these subjects? How can I avoid misleading my audience? So sometimes it's difficult, as I said, to apply this, but really they must be seen as goals to strive for, and not you have to check everything before you start doing it, of course. Right. So again, as a conclusion, the main point is really we should go for it. It's really important that scientists do public advocacy and contribute to the debate, but it should be understood that as a research individual freedom, so use that freedom, but we want to do it responsibly and safely for the scientists, responsibly for the debate we are advocating for, and this requires fulfilling the duties I just described. Now, of course, in this, the role of institutions, they're always wondering what to do with their advocates of scientists. Well, we think they should neither encourage, because it's not part of your job description, nor condemn, because it's an individual freedom. For those who decide to go, they should be helped and provided with clear ethical guidelines on how to do so. And that's the first role of the institution is really to protect the freedom of expression and organize the scientific debate. So on this, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take a few questions.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this presentation, which I think is probably relevant for all the fields, but especially relevant for education and social sciences that are very heavily value laden. And I don't think scientists have the general attitude of sharing the underlying values when they speak about science. I will use my moderator authority to ask a question that I'm very interested in, and then maybe I will take one or two more very quickly from the audience. My question is, and this comes from actually my experience in social science, is how would you separate values and expressing your values and ideology, maybe, or worldviews? And I'm asking this question because often educational scientists are almost accused of being too ideological. Is that different, and how so?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, I'm not an expert on all this, so I will give you my perspective. I think worldviews and values are what are making us act. This is really our entry point in face of a challenge or a problem. So recognizing this, I think, is the first step. And we think every decision should be rational, but well, we have both sides of the brain, of course, the rational and the irrational. So in terms of education, I think what we're trying to do, for example, at the Office for Climate Education, is to make sure that the students understand those different register of knowledge, if you like. There's the academic knowledge, the facts, but then there are the worldviews and ideologies. I mean, is sometimes viewed negatively, but in a way, an ideology is some kind of entering the problem with its own values and wanting people to adhere to it. I like this phrase which says that ideology is when you want to align the fact with your values. And which is very often at the base of science denial, so we think it's science denial, but no, it's keeping aligned with one's values. And I think as scientists we have to recognize this, take it into account, realize our own biases and values. That's not always easy, and certainly factor that in when we are interacting with policymakers and the rest of the society.
Thank you very much. I will just ask Tali, you will kill me afterwards, but just one question, and then maybe Eric, because there have been quite a few questions in the chat. If you can stay a little bit with us and just maybe answer a few. But the one I picked was, I think, interesting because our seminar series focuses specifically on these boundary organizations, as you call them, or intermediaries. And the question is, how do ethical dilemmas and conflicting values differ between researchers and these knowledge brokers within government institutions or in these intermediary organizations?
Well, I think an ethical dilemma is a tension between values. They're probably not very different, but I think probably those boundary organizations are maybe better equipped to deal with them because they know the values and the worldviews of the different stakeholders, the scientists community, the policymakers, or maybe the media, etc. So they know how to make the best interface and because sometimes as scientists, so as I said, as climate scientists, we're learning, but we've been very naive, and being in direct contact with a number of stakeholders was probably needed because we didn't have any boundary organization, like for example in medical research or health, but certainly that's not the way to be on the long term to be organized in society. I think to me health, the relationship between medical research and those health boundary organizations is really important because the level of acceptable risks in terms of health depends on the values of the society, as we saw for COVID. And to me, what we should do about climate change depends also on the level of acceptable risk, the level of many other things which us climate scientists first either have no scientific say on it or maybe have our own views as citizens, but our voice shouldn't be heard on top of any other citizen. So this is something where with those boundary organizations should help base policymaking on evidence, the best possible evidence on climate science, but take into account the values of the stakeholders they are interacting with.
I think this is a really, really good message for many participants here in this room who are actually representing these boundary organizations or have these kinds of knowledge brokering roles. Thank you so much, Eric. I really feel like talking to you one more hour, but unfortunately we can't do that right now. If you're happy to just engage a little bit with the questions, we would thank you, but we also understand.
Yeah, of
thank
course.
You very much.
Thank you so much for your invitation, and happy to continue the exchange in any other format.
That's wonderful. So we would very much like that. Thank you very much, Eric. And I'll hand it back to Tali.
Thank you, Eric. That was really insightful. A great thank you. So now let's shift gears, and I'm inviting you all to think together with us about this peer learning series with Eric's thoughts and words in the back of my mind. To do that, if you could please join us on Mentimeter. So you can scan the QR code that's now on the screen, or you can press the link that's in the chat. I think that's the easiest. You can use either your phone or the computer. Just to say that if you're using the computer, just remember to come back to Zoom after you submit answers in order to see the results. And if you could please, once you log in or sign in, keep the Mentimeter open until the end of the session because we're going to come back to it throughout. So I'm going to give people a moment to go into Mentimeter. It would be extremely helpful for us if you engage with a few questions that we're going to post there. So Hoping that people are managing. Yes, let's begin with two warm-up questions just to get a sense of who's in the room here with us. Great. The first one is, what sector do you work in? We're in education, but we've invited people from other sectors as well. I'm going to give you a moment, and whoever's on the computer, you're welcome to come back to Zoom to see some of the results. Come on, this is not everybody. We can give you another few seconds to go into the Mentimeter. Again, the link is in the Zoom chat. There's a direct link to the Mentimeter. If you have specific technical problems, you can also flag that in the chat and we'll try to help. Okay. Okay, great. So we have quite a few people in education and a bit in others. And what type of organization do you work for? We've moved on to the next question. If you can just answer that and then come back to the Zoom. Because we know that knowledge brokers or intermediaries are across different types of organizations, and we're trying to sort of see who's here with us today. Okay, we can keep that actually on and going, and I'll just keep talking a bit. So now that we know more or less who's in the room today, what will this webinar series that we're planning, what will it cover? Based on our team's earlier research, we identified a clear need for capacity building around specific aspects of knowledge mobilization. That is, what can be done and how to strengthen the use of evidence in policy, which is, I'm sure, what you're all working on. So we've drafted an initial menu of topics, and we'd really love your input on it because we want to know what you think. Please take a moment again on Mentimeter to read through this menu of topics and tick all the ideas that interest you, all those that you think you would register for an interactive webinar on. So I'm just going to give you almost a minute because there's quite a few topics there. And if you could just tick the topics that you find interesting for you or for your organization. This is great. Whoever's done, you can come back to the Zoom screen to see the results. I see that a lot of things are interesting. Okay, at least we were in the right direction. Okay, I think we need to move on. Okay, wait. More people are sending their bubbles. This is beautiful. Thank you so much. And to even better tailor the series to your needs, we'd really appreciate it if you could maybe suggest your own topics that we did not think of. So now in Mentimeter, there's an open text question where you could submit other ideas that you would have for webinar topics. You can submit one idea at a time. So write it in, press submit, and then you can add others as well. I realize that some of you are doing this on your phones and typing on the phone is not so much fun. So also to say that you're always welcome to send us ideas afterwards. Okay, great. This is wonderful. Thank you. This will really help us shape the series. I really appreciate it. And again, if more ideas come to mind later, you feel free to reach out. I'm moving along, but please keep the Mentimeter open because we'll come back to it. So as we just saw, we identified several themes that are highly relevant across contexts, such as yours. And today we'll hear brief previews of 3 such topics, each of which will be later explored at a full-length webinar. Each of our presenters today will speak for 5 minutes, followed by 1 minute we will allow you to give feedback on Mentimeter, suggesting sub-themes or questions that you would like for us to cover in the full-length webinar on that topic. And maybe if you think you could contribute to such a webinar, you could write that in as well. And once all 3 have presented, each speaker will get exactly 1 minute to respond to a comment of their choice. So our first speaker is Eleanor McKillop, a research fellow at the Wales Centre for Public Policy, a knowledge broker based in Cardiff, University, Wales. Eleanor looks at how evidence and research inform policy and practice. She's currently leading a project examining the impact of the UK What Works centres, so she is extremely well placed to speak to us today about the impact of knowledge brokering activities. Eleanor, over to you.
Thank you, Tali. Thank you, Tali. Thank you, Nora. And thanks to the rest of the team at the OECD for inviting me. I'm extremely looking forward to this presentation and to hearing your feedback. So today I'm going to be talking about the research that we've been conducting with What Works centres in the UK to understand how decision makers at local and national level understand their impact on their practice, on their skills, on their knowledge, on their organization and the wider system. So just to give you a bit of information first on the What Works centres themselves. So they're a group of organizations set up in the UK to bring What Works evidence to decision makers at different levels. So they generate evidence, synthesize the evidence, they help decision makers implement that evidence, and they build their capacity to use evidence. So here by evidence, we mean research evidence, but also other sources of evidence like RCTs, randomized control trials, but also lived experience and a whole other array of evidence. So based on that data, those interviews that we conducted, we think that knowledge brokers, such as What Works centres, can have 4 types of impact. So I'll start with the one that is most commonly discussed, which is the instrumental impact. So here people will often focus on citations in policy documents, but we think that is quite a reductive understanding of this impact. And decision makers that we spoke to talked about how the knowledge brokers, so the What Works Centre that they were talking about, had helped them to develop new policies and decisions and helped inform their practice with, for instance, toolkits and models such as theories of change. The What Works centres and their evidence were also seen as a seal of approval to support the decision makers to say to others, to demonstrate to others that they were doing the right thing. And also What Works centres and the evidence were often used by decision makers to ask for more funding or to continue to do certain programs and policies. So let's say in discussions with their treasuries, they would mobilize this evidence to say that we are doing the right thing. And also those knowledge brokers would also help decision makers to stop doing things that weren't evidence-based and that weren't working. So they would help with, for instance, evaluations and synthesis of what was happening elsewhere in the world. So second type of impact that emerged is what we refer to as conceptual impact. And here we mean how these knowledge brokers are changing how people think about an issue and the role of evidence in decision making. So here, these decision makers talked about how the brokers had helped them to change how they thought about an issue, such as homelessness or educational attainment. And the What Works Centre had also helped them to steer decision makers towards considering certain types of evidence in their practice. So for instance, if they weren't looking at randomized control trials, they would suggest that, but also on the other end of the spectrum, looking at lived experience and how that could inform their policy making and the decision making. A third impact that was mentioned was the relational impact. And so here, What Works centres were seen as really good in convening people and organizations who mattered in a field. So let's say if we talk about education, they were seen as really good as bringing together the key leaders in that field so that the decision makers can network hop They could meet like-minded people, speak to other, let's say teachers could speak to other teachers, people working in education department could speak to other people in other countries, for instance, to understand how to address ongoing issues, borrow policy tools, and also build new collaborations. And finally, a fourth impact was to do with capacity building, and this was already mentioned before, and how these knowledge brokers can help to strengthen the capacities and skills of decision makers and their teams, especially when it comes to evidence. So, for instance, a lot of decision-making organizations collect a huge array of internal or administrative data. The term might vary. And the centers, the WhatWorks centers, were seen as really helpful in helping these decision makers access, assess, use, and monitor these huge amounts of data. But also they help them to develop new skills to address existing and wicked problems in a different way. So they help them think differently about issue. So what I want to conclude on is the crucial importance of context in all of this at an individual, an organizational, and at a systems level. So what are the skills and capacities of the individuals who are engaging with that evidence and with the broker? This will influence this latter's impact, and also how evidence ready is the organization. We talk a lot about what the brokers are doing and how good they are or not good at doing certain things, but we often don't look at the organization. So let's say the local authority, the school, the government, how ready are they to use evidence? What is their organizational culture when it comes to evidence? And again, this has been mentioned already. And finally, the wider context, the system within which all this is happening. What are the politics? What are the agendas? What is the funding? And whether the goals of the knowledge broker and their programs, do they align with the goals of the decision makers? And this really needs to be taken into account when you think about setting up a knowledge broker initiative to make it successful. So thank you.
That's wonderful, Eleanor. Thanks so much. It really resonates with things that Eric spoke about before, right? So please take 1 minute in Mentimeter again. It would be extremely helpful if you could write questions or sub-themes on the theme that Eleanor just presented for us to address in the actual webinar, or if you could contribute to such a webinar yourselves. So the Mentimeter is open for 1 minute. Okay, thank you. Our next speaker addresses something that's on everybody's minds these days, AI. Annika Wilmers, a professor of societal responsibility at the School of Personal Development and of Education at Frankfurt University of Applied Scientists, and researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Research and Information in Education, DIEP in Germany, will talk to us of AI's potential for evidence synthesis and use. Annika.
Yes, thank you very much. So I would like to focus on 2 points concerning this topic. And my first one is to highlight some trends in research that make it necessary to go into the direction of using AI when aiming to synthesize existing research and to generate a solid knowledge base. These are that we do see a large increase in research overall. For example, if I do a simple search for curriculum and planning in the ERIC database for educational research and just compare the titles that were found, I receive roughly 7,600 titles for the end of the year 1980. I already received roughly 17,700 titles at the end of the year 2000. And then I did a search last week and actually received for the same topic almost 25,000 literature titles. So this increase makes it more and more difficult to handle the research base. We also see an internationalization of research communities, also leading to an increase in accessible research and accessible languages, and the tendency to solve problems from an international perspective. This is, of course, a very good development, but it's also difficult to handle. And we see pressing demands from policy and practice to solve specific issues in short time. This becomes very visible in times of crisis like the COVID pandemic or war situations. But overall, almost every topic policy and practice deal with are actually pressing topics that asks for solutions. So this brings me to my second point. Can AI help to handle these challenges? If so, the hope is that the use of AI reduces resources when conducting research synthesis, and this could apply to all different steps, such as searching, screening, clustering of topics, including translations and updating of synthesis. And at the moment, we already see that it's possible to support all these work steps with AI, and specific software programs already include AI options now. Nevertheless, we also see particular challenges in the field of education and specifically in education. And just to give some examples, these are linked to, for example, the terminology in education research, for which theoretical concepts are very important, but not always clear and may change continuously. For example, the terminology linked to the monitoring of education systems varied from decade to decade and country to country in past years. And we cannot just tell AI to search for this one term, as it would not find all relevant information. Another point is the interdisciplinarity in education research that requires to look at education from many different angles, like pedagogy, sociology, politics, and so on. And the high influence of contextual factors like specific policies or traditions in the school systems, often leading to very broad literature searches. And linked to this are some difficulties to handle literature searches in different languages, as terms that work in one educational setting may not lead to the same results in another language, or may at least require a lot of extra work first to adapt the use of AI for different approaches. I can also give you one example for this. I mentioned the topic of curriculum planning above. If you want to do an automated search for this, you have to be aware of the fact that curriculum actually has a much broader meaning in the German context and a much more narrow meaning in the US context. And these are just two contexts I just picked out now, among many other different countries and possibilities how you can interpret this term. So if you're not aware of such differences between languages, cultures, and systems, there's a higher risk of bias and unsatisfactory results when using AI. And of course, this risk exists as well if not using AI. But I just want to stress that AI is not as such the key to solve all these problems. So as a consequence, at the moment in education science, some topics are easier to handle with AI support than others. For example, working on virtual reality settings in a classroom might be easier to handle than working on management decisions in education systems. So to sum up, we do see very promising effects when using AI in research processes and possibilities for very interesting constellations. For example, when it comes to literature screening, we can imagine that one real person is the first screener and AI is the second screener, for example. But it's just highly important to be aware of the specificities of educational topics when starting using these processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. That's fascinating and very, very relevant. Again, everybody, if you could go back to the Mentimeter and put in questions or sub-themes on the issue of AI that you would love us to touch upon or that you could contribute to. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that, please. If you're still on a previous question, you can just press submit. It will offer you to skip the question and move ahead to where we're at. Okay, great. Thank you. Our final speaker helps us make sense of what happens in governments. Kari Elisabeth Skogen is a senior advisor in the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. She recently submitted her PhD thesis on how civil servants or government officials use research knowledge in their work. So she will speak to us of the research use roles of different actors across ministries. Kari Elisabeth?
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen because I have a very short presentation as well. Just a minute. Let's see. Wants to work now. There we go. Thank you so much for inviting me. And as you said in your very nice introduction, Tali, I work in the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. And 3 weeks ago, I did submit my PhD thesis as well. And this PhD thesis was funded through a Norwegian public sector PhD scheme, which allowed me to conduct the PhD while employed in the ministry. And this scheme is, relevantly enough, established just to build bridges between the scientific and the public sector. And also, my PhD was about how government officials in ministries use research in their daily tasks. And today I will very briefly present 1 or 2 central findings from my research, specifically from a scientific paper that is currently undergoing peer review, where I, together with 3 colleagues, investigated how government officials access research knowledge and how they disseminate research knowledge inside their organizations. In essence, it's about how different roles and practices contribute to spanning the boundaries between research and policy. It is based on a substantial survey with about 1,600 respondents, all government officials in different Norwegian ministries. And we find that government officials engage with research in different ways. And I will illustrate this by presenting a simplified Venn diagram. When accessing research, some government officials approach the research directly, using scientific channels and sources. They are placed within this blue oval circle, while others rely more heavily on informal channels and sources, accessing research through intermediaries or by asking a colleague, often accessing translated research. And this group of government officials is placed in the green circle. And as you can see, there is some overlap between these 2 groups, but generally, government officials tend to do either or. They primarily access research either directly or indirectly. Likewise, when disseminating research inside their organizations, some government officials tend to do this in formal ways, such as holding presentations about research or writing summaries of the research that they share with their colleagues and leaders. These are placed in the orange circle. While others, again, primarily disseminate research knowledge in informal ways, such as chatting about research by the coffee machine. And here as well, there is some overlap between the groups, but the general finding is different patterns in practice. Individual skills, experiences, formal roles, personal habits, and knowledge of these alternatives may influence the patterns. Furthermore, to try and understand more about government officials who hold central roles in connecting research and policy, we extracted the ones who most frequently access and disseminate research from the rest of the respondents. And we combined the 2 access groups into one and the 2 dissemination groups into one. The results reveal 3 complementary boundary spanning roles. We label the first group accumulators, as they focus on gathering knowledge. They frequently access research directly and or indirectly, but they do not frequently disseminate research. The second group is labeled disseminators, as they focus on sharing the knowledge. These frequently disseminate research formally and or informally, but they do not frequently access research. And we call the third group bridgers, as they actively build bridge through frequently accessing and disseminating research knowledge in one or more ways. We conclude in our study that government officials in general, and these groups of boundary spanners in particular, play distinct and complementary roles in connecting research and policy. The findings highlight the importance of understanding the different research practices of individual government officials to facilitate complementarity in practice, not just in theory, and the importance of building effective structures for sharing knowledge within policy organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kari Elizabeth. That was very, very interesting and relevant. Again, last time on these, could you in Mentimeter add any questions on this topic of research use in government or any contribution that you could make to such a webinar, so that we don't leave Carrie Elizabeth alone in this endeavor. I'm going to give you almost a minute to do that. Mentimeter is open, and again, you can skip by submitting to the next slide. Okay, just because I'm aware of time, I will now be very, very strict and ask each of our three presenters to react in just 1 minute to whatever comment they picked from the audience or a final word. Eleanor, can we start with you?
Yes, and please stop me if I go over time. So I think out of all the comments, the most popular was this question of how evidence ready an organization is. So I'm going to respond to that because I think that responds to most of the comments. So I think to think about what evidence ready looks like for a government or for a school, I think I'd look at how trained the members of that organization are, from the minister or from the head of school to the senior policy officials to the bottom of the organization, if we want to say bottom. So capacities and skills to use evidence. Also, what training is available for them to improve and kind of become more comfortable with using evidence. And we find that a lot when they deal with academics or brokers. They almost have a complex of, oh, maybe I'm not sure, should I be saying that? And I think breaking down that boundary is really important. Also, what induction processes exist. So in Wales now, they have put in place a kind of evidence module in how they train their civil servants so that they know how to access evidence, and they are given loads of potential ways to access the evidence in different ways for different needs. Also, the organization that we looked at, the various ones, had, for instance, established central initiatives like a data pool. Okay, I'll stop. That went so fast.
That was really good. Yeah, but we're going to move ahead. Annika, can I turn to you?
Yes, so I tried to make this quick as well. I had very many interesting questions, many dealing with the risk of bias when using AI and how we can handle this. And on the one hand, I think it's really important to stress the human factor. That is important, and that is different, for example, from research synthesis in the medical field, where you can look at one specific treatment or intervention or so, and it's just a difference in our field. And one is asking for how to prevent fake scientific evidence that is coming in. And I think that's a very interesting and even broader question, because we actually need to make sure that this kind of fake evidence is not entering the system at all. So not entering the databases, the journals. We need control systems everywhere to prevent this kind of thing happening, so that we are actually not researching this kind of literature later on. So, and AI might be helpful in the future actually to tackle this as well. So we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just after under a minute. And Carrie Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you. So I didn't have that much time to look at the question, so I will talk about something I would like to add. So, because interestingly, or perhaps completely natural, individual government officials are seldom very aware of their own use practices, or at least they're not very aware of how their own practices differ from that of their colleagues. So this relates to both how and where they search for research, how they assess the quality and relevance of the research, and how they disseminate it, implement it, or stores it for later use. And I truly believe that organizations and individuals would benefit from more open communication about these topics. Not because I believe that everyone should do the same thing, because I really don't. However, I do believe that we may learn from each other and that we could better reap the benefits of complementarity if we are aware of it. And because, at least in Norway, some processes could be more systematic than they are today. And I see that one tiny question about if you can disseminate without accessing research first. And of course, when looking at, for example, the boundary spanners, the ones we call disseminators, these are the ones that frequently disseminate research. And it means that they have to access, but they place more time and focus on the dissemination than the acquisition of the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting, and learning from each other is exactly why we're here today. So if you could all, we would really appreciate it if you could stay for 3 more minutes, just 3 final points that I would love to make. First of all, a huge thank you to all of you. That was fascinating. Important points to finish on. First, the upcoming webinars will take a variety of formats. Some are planned to be open international knowledge exchanges, but others are going to follow Chatham House rules. That means they're going to be closed and unrecorded, as opposed to this one today, which was recorded, but only for our community. And those would be like that in order to allow for a more open discussion. And we're also considering different styles of webinars. We would love to ask you for your input. This is absolutely the last slide on Mentimeter on the style of webinar that you think is more useful. If you could go into Mentimeter for a last time and just rate the different styles that we're suggesting. We have Ask the Expert, a live case study, and a peer assistance model. Okay, so at least you don't hate these ideas. This is good. 10 more seconds to rate these. Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Next, we're really excited to announce a new way to stay connected, for us to stay connected. We're launching a community platform where we can continue the conversation, share events, share resources amongst ourselves, ask questions, which we did not have enough time for today, for example, and start maybe collaborations. In short, this is a space where we really want to create a community of practice among the people here today and some others. So after today's session, we'll be sending you an invitation to join the platform. The recording of this session, for example, and a space to suggest more ideas will also be posted there, and we really encourage you to engage. This could be a meaningful opportunity for all of us to connect with each other between the webinar sessions as well. Finally, based on your feedback today, we'll shape the rest of the webinar series, and of course, we'll keep you updated on the coming webinars via this new platform. And of course, we're always happy to also hear from you directly with any ideas or suggestions. I'd like to thank our speakers for their amazing contributions today. I'd like to thank all of you very much for joining us and engaging in all of our many questions. This has been really, really great, and we hope to see you soon. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mai.
Thank you.